My grandmother was born in the 1890s. She died in the late 1970s. And if anybody had told her in the 1930s or 1940s, early 1940s, that the United States would spend more time worried about the region that she used to call the Near East, but we now call the Middle East. If anyone had told her that the United States would spend more time worrying about the Middle East in the second half of the 20th century, in the first part of the 21st century, than just about any other region on Earth, she would have thought that the person telling her this was nuts. Because to my grandmother and to the generation that grew up at that time, the Middle East, I say the Near East, was something that they almost never thought about. To the extent that my grandmother did think about the Middle East, she thought of it as, at least part of it, as the Holy Land. And my grandmother was a great traveler. My grandmother and my grandfather, they loved to travel all over the world. And one of the places they loved to go was the Holy Land. My grandmother was a devout Catholic. And the Holy Land to her meant the places that Jesus had lived in, had walked upon the earth. So Bethlehem, Nazareth, Jerusalem, the places that are associated with the foundation of the Christian faith. Now, it's an apt label, not simply for Christians, but for Jews. The Holy Land, Israel, was their original homeland. And for Muslims, Jerusalem is the second holiest city in the world after Mecca. So the Holy Land is holy not simply to American Christians, but to Jews of America, Europe, and other parts of the world, and to Muslims around the world. So Holy Land is an apt name for that region that is now occupied by Israel, Jordan, that vicinity, and that's in dispute between those countries, including the West Bank. So the Holy Land was what Americans thought of generally when they thought of the Middle East, this before World War II. Some of them, especially American Jews, had particular reason to think about this part of the world because there was a movement afoot in America, a movement afoot in Europe, for the creation of a homeland, the recreation of a homeland for the world's Jews. The movement was called Zionism, for the original name for the Jewish homeland, Zion. And so Jewish Zionists paid attention to what was going on in the Middle East. During the period between World War I and World War II, it was administered by Britain. It was a little bit, and the region was called Palestine, and it was administered by Britain. There were Palestinians living there, but there were also Jews from various parts of the world who were finding their way to Palestine. And the hope was that they would be able to recreate a Jewish homeland in Palestine, in the location of the original Jewish homeland back in the days before the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, the 70th year of the Common Era, by the Romans. So when Americans thought of the Holy Land, thought of the Middle East, they thought in those terms. There was another small bunch of Americans, those who were connected to the oil industry, who were starting to think of the Middle East in terms of its oil. The region around the Persian Gulf, the region controlled particularly at this point by Saudi Arabia, a relatively new country. Arabia had been around, but the fact that it was called Saudi Arabia was relatively new. It was of interest to Americans who had interests in the oil industry. So there are a lot of Texans who knew about the oil fields of the Persian Gulf of the Middle East. Now, not that those oil fields were thought to be a supplier to American consumers, because certainly before World War II, the United States had all the oil of its own that it could consume. In fact, the United States was a very large producer, and it didn't consume all the oil that it produced. So the people who were interested were those who were in the oil industry themselves and hoped maybe to get a concession producing the oil of the Persian Gulf region of Saudi Arabia, and some strategic thinker types who realized that the countries of Europe, this is now we're thinking about, say, during World War II, thinking that after World War II, the countries of Western Europe are going to have to find oil because the world economy it had by this time largely completed its shift from steam power as produced by coal to oil power, diesel oil, gasoline, and so on. And so the developing economies, the re-emerging economies of Europe after World War II will need access to oil. Some of the oil might come from the United States. Some of it might come from places like Mexico, but the Middle East was closer to Europe, and so it seemed like a natural source of oil for Europeans. But the number of times, for example, that the Middle East showed up on the front pages of American newspapers, you could probably count on one hand per year. The Middle East just was not on America's radar screen. And in fact, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, it pretty much remained off of the radar screen. There wasn't that much fighting in World War II that took place in the Middle East. And the big areas of concern for the United States were Western Europe, and particularly Germany, what's going to happen to Germany, and places like Japan, where American troops were in occupation, and Korea, which was divided, and who knew what the future of that country would be. So the Middle East was this backwater, but in the 10 years after World War II, there were three issues in particular, or three developments in particular, that put it on America's radar screen. And the first, I've already mentioned, was oil. Oil became a big deal for American policymakers. Again, not for American consumers yet. Americans aren't buying much in the way of Middle Eastern oil. There is enough oil in America's oil fields to keep American cars and factories running. But Middle Eastern oil is important for the development, for the reconstruction of Europe's economy. The Marshall Plan was the key program in America's assistance to European reconstruction, and American policymakers began to realize that all that money, those billions of dollars spent on European reconstruction, would be wasted if a steady, reliable supply of oil to the European economy, the Western European economy, could not be guaranteed. So Americans began thinking of Middle Eastern oil as a strategic resource, a strategic asset. The stability of America's alliance system came to rest, it seemed, on secure access to Middle Eastern oil. So American policymakers are thinking about this. Item number one, oil. Item number two, Israel. The Zionists succeeded in their project of recreating a homeland, a home state for the world's Jews in 1948, when Israel was created by verdict, by fiat of the United Nations. And the United States was one of the first countries to was the first country to recognize this new state of Israel. It was controversial, the creation of Israel, because the creation of Israel took land from Palestinians. And there was a grave debate over whether the land belonged to the Palestinians, who were most recently there. Did it belong to the Jews by virtue of their having occupied it, their ancestors 2,000 years before having occupied it? Did they have a claim to it? Did they have a claim to it as refugees from World War II? Now, the fact that in 1945, the Holocaust of European Jewry by the Nazi Third Reich came to light. And it made very clear something that many Jews had felt over the centuries, that the Jews would never be safe until they had a land of their own. And given what had happened to the Jews of Europe during World War II, the massacring, the murdering of 6 million of them, it caused many countries and peoples to think, the Zionists are right. The Jews need a state of their own. So there was support for the creation of Israel that wouldn't have been there, and that wasn't there, in fact, when the issue came up 20 years earlier. Nowhere near the support. But after World War II, it seemed that the Zionists had a point, and they needed the support of, among others, the United Nations. But the Palestinians, who were displaced by the creation of Israel, objected. In fact, they objected very loudly, and a war broke out at the moment of the creation of Israel. The UN had called for a partition of Palestine, and the Palestinians said, no, our land has been stolen, and we're not going to take it lying down. So immediately a war broke out between Palestinians and Jews. We'll call them Israelis now because Israel has its own country. And several of the Arab countries around joined in. And so Israel was born in war, and Israel felt very threatened from the beginning, and with good reason. So from the standpoint of the United States, the creation of Israel was a plus and a potential minus. It was a plus because most Americans sympathized to one degree or another with the idea of a state for the Jews, this Zionist project, and especially for American Jews. It was something that touched a very deep chord. So the creation of Israel is this good thing for those people who support the Zionist project. The creation of Israel, I won't say it's a bad thing, but it's a potentially troublesome thing because the United States recognized, American leaders recognized, that most of the people living in the Middle East are Arabs and Muslims. And they were not happy with the creation of this new state of Jews on land that they saw as taken from the Palestinians. So for the United States to side directly and enthusiastically with Israel would tend to alienate the Arabs, who are the immediate neighbors, and then Muslims who are farther neighbors. Muslims in the Middle East include Iranians, Persians, for example, who are not Arabs, but are Muslims. So the United States had to, American leaders at any rate, felt obliged to tread fairly carefully in relations in the Middle East on the subject of Israel during the first, 10, 20 years after the creation of Israel. So, I should point out that alienating the Arabs risked the security of Western Europe's supply of oil. It was the case that the Arabs had the oil in the Middle East. So, on the one hand, American leaders are sympathetic to Israel, but on the other hand, they don't want to alienate the Arabs who have the oil. So we've got the issues of oil, we've got the issue of Israel, and of course, by the late 1940s, we've got the issue of the Cold War. So the Soviet Union, is there going to be Soviet penetration of the Middle East? This was a concern. In fact, some of the first concerns of American leaders regarding the Middle East related to the Soviet Union, the potential expansion of communism. The Truman Doctrine was triggered by events in Turkey and Greece. Greece is not usually considered in the Middle East. Turkey is, though. And so Americans were alerted to what was going on in the Middle East, and President Truman felt inspired to issue the Truman Doctrine over events in the Middle East. So there was that concern. An initial, not exactly a showdown with the Soviet Union, but what a challenge by the Soviet Union. It occurred even before that in 1946, when Soviet troops were a little bit slow to evacuate Iran. Soviet troops had moved into Iran during World War II, not because they particularly wanted to take over Iran, but they wanted to make sure that German troops not move up and seize the oil fields of Iran. And the Soviets had agreed to withdraw their troops after the war, but they were taking their time doing it. And Harry Truman, the President of the United States, felt obliged to issue something of a warning saying, you said you were going to, you better do it. Now, nothing came of it except that Americans were alerted to they were reminded of the proximity of the Soviet Union to Iran. They share a border, and through Iran to the Persian Gulf, where all the oil was. So Americans, during the first 2 decades of the Cold War, never thought about the Middle East without thinking about it in the context of competition with the Soviet Union. So, oil, Israel, and the Soviet Union. As far as particular issues go, what did American leaders have to decide? What did they have to do? Well, they did have to take a position in the first war between Israel and its neighbors, and their diplomacy was aimed at stopping the war. We just don't want this war to go on. We don't want the Middle East to blow up. In fact, that was a consistent position of the United States. Do not let the Middle East blow up. Do not let things in the Middle East get so bad that the United States feels obliged to intervene. Certainly, we don't want to have to send troops to the Middle East because we've got troops in Germany, in Western Europe, we've got troops in Japan and in Korea. We've got obligations all over the world. We don't need any more obligations. In fact, Americans were happy enough to leave Western interests in the Middle East in the hands of other countries, particularly Britain. Britain had been the great colonial power in much of the Near East, as the British call it. In fact, so the labeling, it was Near East, Middle East, Far East. And those were labels that were applied by British diplomats. And they registered the proximity to Britain. So the Near East was the part of that region closest to Britain. The Middle East was a bit farther, and the Far East, East Asia, was the farthest part of Asia. So anyway, that's where the names come from. So Americans were happy enough to leave Britain in charge. And the fact that Britain had said it was pulling out of Greece and Turkey, that's what triggered the Truman Doctrine. The British didn't want to pull out of other parts of the Middle East because they considered them essential for British interests in the decades to come. And a crucial British interest was control of the Suez Canal, a canal that links the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and crosses Egyptian territory. The British had negotiated the British and the French originally had negotiated a concession with an Egyptian government back in the 19th century to build the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal Company later came under partial control of the British government. And the British government derived revenues from tolls from the canal. But furthermore, the Suez Canal, from the time it opened in 1869 until World War II and after, was a lifeline between the British Isles, Britain itself, and India, and Britain's other interests in South Asia and Southeast Asia. It was a several thousand-mile shortcut to go through the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, the Red Sea to get to India, as opposed to going around the southern tip of Africa. So the British were really concerned about the Suez Canal. By the 1850s, the British no longer controlled India or Pakistan as colonies, but nonetheless, the British still had interests in the Persian Gulf area. They still had interests and connections to India, and anything that jeopardized access to the Suez Canal was something that made them nervous. So when the Egyptian government, led by a former colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser, led by Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal Company to use the money to build a dam on the Nile River, the British went nuts, almost. Well, maybe they did actually go nuts. They decided that they were going to conspire to overthrow Nasser, whom they considered this madman. And they got together with the government of France and the government of Israel, each of which had reasons not to like Nasser, to be suspicious of Nasser. And the three of them hatched this plan that was designed to overthrow Nasser. Now, it seemed like a wild idea after it began to unfurl. But it didn't seem like such a wild idea in the planning because the British had been instrumental just 3 years earlier in the overthrow of a government it didn't like in Iran. So if we did it in Iran, why can't we do it in Egypt? Well, the big difference was that in the case of Iran, the United States had the support and approval of the American government. But in the case of Suez in 1956, they did not. Dwight Eisenhower was president, and Dwight Eisenhower thought the idea of starting this war to overthrow Nasser was absolutely nuts. In the first place, it wouldn't work, and in the second place, it would tar all Westerners in the Middle East as insufferable imperialists, and the United States wouldn't have anything to do with it. The British government thought that they could basically pull a fast one on the United States and Eisenhower. They wouldn't tell Eisenhower they were going to do it, but once they started it, Eisenhower would have no choice but to support them. After all, Britain and France were allies of the United States in NATO, and they knew, and the United States American leaders knew how nervous the British and the French were about Nasser, and of course the United States would be sympathetic to Israel, and so the United States would just kind of look the other way when the British sent troops, and as they did, troops to Egypt to occupy the canal zone, the region around the canal, and then they hoped this would lead to an uprising that would overthrow the government of Nasser. But Eisenhower said, no, this isn't going to happen. The British knew, but they didn't want to admit, that without American support this simply couldn't happen because Britain by this time was dependent on the United States. It was dependent on the United States for oil, and it was dependent on the United States for money. And when this British action in the Middle East caused the value of the British pound, their currency, to plummet, and the United States didn't support it by buying lots of it to keep the value of the pound up. And when Eisenhower made clear that the British could not expect any deliveries of oil from the United States or from other regions that the United States controlled, then the British government had to back out. It was an enormous embarrassment for the British government. It led to the overthrow of the British administration. The Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, was knocked out of power. And it led to a brutal realization on the part of British leaders and the British public that Brands' law, Brands' fourth law of history applies. Sooner or later, countries get the foreign policy they can afford. By the 1950s, the British could no longer afford the foreign policy that they had gotten used to over the previous century. 80 years before, the British would have been able to pull this thing off on their own. They would not have needed American support. The United States could not have vetoed this plan. But in 1956, when the United States exercised its veto, the British could not afford to carry on their own. And there was an entire generation of Britons, of British leaders, the British public, that felt traumatized by this moment because they were used to Britain being this great global power, and now they have to realize all of a sudden we're a second-rate power. When America says jump, Britain has to say how high. Sooner or later, countries get the foreign policy they can afford. It works on the upside, it works on the downside. So, in 1956, the United States, by vetoing this action on the part of Britain, France, and Israel, made really clear that the United States was now the one to call the shots for, we'll call it the Western Alliance system in the Middle East. Eisenhower was concerned that Nasser, who came out of this crisis looking heroic, would get too big for his britches, that Nasser's ambitions would simply grow. And Eisenhower didn't like Nasser any more than the British and the French did. So Eisenhower decided to demonstrate that the United States would pick up where the British and the French left off. In 1958, there was a challenge to a pro-Western, pro-American government in Lebanon, a country not far from Egypt. And Eisenhower took the opportunity to send U.S. troops into Lebanon. They probably weren't necessary to preserve this particular government in power, but the opposition, the insurgents, were supported by Nasser. And it demonstrated to the world and to Nasser that he wasn't going to have his way with the Middle East, that the Americans were here and they were paying attention. Now, Eisenhower didn't leave the troops in. He had no desire to leave an occupying American force in the Middle East. It was really just a demonstration, a show that the United States could do this, so you had better watch out. So this was the situation into the early 1960s. And in the 9 years between 1956 and 1967, things in the Middle East they continued to get tense. Nasser remained in power in Egypt, and he continued to talk of pan-Arab nationalism. The Arabs of the world were divided up into a bunch of countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And what Nasser talked about was bringing them all into, what he called the United Arab Republic. And Eisenhower and American leaders, and then John Kennedy after Eisenhower, they looked skeptically upon this project because Nasser was kind of socialist. He was unnervingly friendly toward the Soviet Union. And if Nasser somehow got his hands on the oil of the Middle East, then it would give him a kind of power and a clout that American leaders didn't want him to have. But American leaders did not want to take him on directly. Again, America had responsibilities in all sorts of other parts of the world, and they didn't want to volunteer for any new responsibilities. So what Eisenhower did during his last couple of years in office, what John Kennedy did, what Lyndon Johnson did until 1967, was basically try to keep a lid on things in the Middle East. Again, trying to negotiate this path between support for Israel and not alienating the Arabs who had the oil. Again, support for Israel. Israel was democracy. Israel had personal connections. Israelis had personal connections to lots of Americans. And so there was this sympathy for Israel, but a feeling that strategic interests of the United States depended on cultivating the Arabs, at least the Arabs who had oil. And also, by this time, Iran is developing its oil fields. Iran shares frontage on the Persian Gulf with Saudi Arabia and with Kuwait, of whom we'll hear more later. And so the United States was trying to make sure that the oil industry in the Middle East doesn't get disrupted. The last thing Americans wanted was a war, a general war in the Middle East, because what the war would do was cause oil prices to skyrocket. And that would, well, it would benefit American oil producers because the world price of oil would go up and their price of oil would go up too, and all would be fine for them. But for that much larger number of Americans who consumed oil, it would be bad news. It could very easily cause a recession in the United States, cause a recession in Europe, and that would be bad. Any elected officials do not like recessions because recessions mean that voters are grumpy when they go to the polls. And when they're grumpy, they tend to vote out incumbents. So, American policy toward the Middle East in the late 50s and early 60s was keep a lid on things. American leaders got wind in 1966 and early 1967 that another war might be coming. The issue of the existence of Israel was still something that was challenged by most of the Arabs and actually many countries of the world. The Arabs and many of the world's Muslims, most of the world's Muslims, took the position that Israel was an illegitimate state. And there were regular calls, said to be on behalf of the world's Arabs and Muslims, that Israel should be destroyed, Israel should be driven into the sea. And Israelis, needless to say, didn't much like this way of thinking. This was their country, and as they saw it, had the approval of the United Nations, which represented, if anything did, the world community, and they were going to defend it. They were not going to be put in a position where they were at the mercy of other people the way many of them had been before and during World War II. So the memory of the Holocaust was seared deeply into most Israeli minds, and they were going to defend themselves against any challenge. So when Nasser in 1967 began talking loudly as though he was going to defend the Arabs, he was going to take the lead in reclaiming this land that had been taken by these Israeli interlopers, the Israelis got nervous and they prepared for war too. And things got closer and closer to war in the spring and early summer of 1967. And the Johnson administration heard about this, heard that this was going on, and tried to talk to both sides. This should not be a war. Don't go to war. Don't go to war. The United States had very little leverage with Nasser, who had written off Americans as imperialists, as allies of the Israelis, and they usually call them the Zionists. And the United States had some leverage with Israel, but not all that much, because the Israelis felt that their very existence was at stake. Israel is a small country. It was even smaller then than it is now, very narrow in some places. So Arab armies could march and cut Israel in half. If they got a good running start, they could do it in a couple of hours. So the Israelis were acutely aware of this. And so at the last minute, when it looked as though the Egyptians were about to attack, the Israelis preempted by launching their attack, and a war began. And it's sometimes called the June War of 1967, took place in June 1967, or the Six-Day War, because the war only lasted 6 days. And it ended in a stunning Israeli victory. Not only did the Israelis defeat the Egyptians and the Syrians and the other Arab countries and fighters who came to the aid of Egypt, it was primarily against Egypt, but against these other countries as well. Not only did the Israelis defeat the Arab armies, but they seized large chunks of territory. In particular, they seized the Sinai Peninsula, which was a big, largely deserted area that led to the Suez Canal. And so the Israelis expanded their southern border, giving them breathing room against Egypt, because on the other side of the Suez Canal, on the other side of the Sinai, was Egypt. They seized the Golan Heights, a strategic highland that had been part of Syria before the war, but had heights for gun emplacement, could shoot down on Israeli targets. And so they seized that, so the Syrians, of one group of their Arab enemies, couldn't continue to shoot down. They seized the west bank of the Jordan River, which, by seizing it, it greatly increased the width of Israel, but also included many of the sites that were holy in Jewish thinking. And so as part of the Jewish Holy Land, and they seized the Gaza Strip, a region that had been governed by Egypt on the Mediterranean Sea. And so in the course of these 6 days, Israeli territory expanded greatly and left the Israelis in occupation of this great bit of land. And what would become of that was something that would vex the Middle East and American policymakers for years afterwards.